Hello. If you've been following the channel for a while, you may be expecting a different greeting, but this is my introductory video to hopefully what will be a relatively protracted discussion on horror. Feel free to add your comments below. I will likely ignore any disagreements you make, but if you have a well-argued one, I will likely actually respond to it, either in a video or on the comments. That said, you may not agree with all of my definitions on what horror is, and that's what we're going to be talking about today, is what I define as horror, what we're going to be talking about, what elements constitute a horror story over what elements are considered to be horror that aren't necessarily guaranteed. For instance, vampires. 30 years ago, if it was a vampire story, it was a horror story, but now we've got vampires used as allegory for homosexuality in Anne Rice. We've got vampires used as terrible, horrifying romance in Twilight, and Vampire Diaries TV show, and all of this horrible predator is sexy bullshit. Not horror. So that's going to be the extent I talk about it for the most part, unless it gets brought up as part of a comparison between, say, the mythology of vampires versus what they've become and all of that crap. But let's start by discussing what horror is. And to me, again, so I'm not a definition, I'm not a scholar, I'm an enthusiast, I'm an autodidact. I've taught myself what I know, so I'm not a critic, I'm not a trained scholar, I'm not expecting you to go and use me as a reference point in a class. I don't have any background to establish that. This is just a way to hedge stuff out and to put stuff out there, because I think more people need to be involved in horror. There was a boom of it in the 20s and 30s because of pulp magazines, and I think with the internet, I think we could actually get that start kind of thing going again, and I think there needs to be more horror in the world. I do. And that's why I'm trying to work on stuff, and this will help me work out ideas in my head. But let's talk about it first. Horror invokes the supernatural, whether it explains it or not, whether it's clear or not. It, to some extent, it invokes the supernatural. It's the difference between Saw, the first Saw movie, and the first Halloween movie. Michael Myers, there's something clearly supernatural there. Jigsaw is clearly just really well organized. He's a Batman villain, but he can't take a bullet. Now, you could argue he can hold his breath for 2 hours, so fuck, there's something. But not inherently supernatural. Not even implied to be supernatural, whereas Michael Myers, there is something implied to be supernatural about him. Jason, there's clearly something supernatural about him. Blah, 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 blah. You get the goddamn point. If it's not supernatural, there's nothing supernatural about it. I consider it a thriller, and that's why we have that distinction. So supernatural, and it makes you scared. Not necessarily, not a whole lot of people get scared at, say, every horror story. I have never in my life been scared by a Stephen King story, but I have read stories by other authors who actually made me not want to be out of my house after dark for a night. It depends on how the writer gets to you, how their tone is, how their style is. And again, we're going to be talking about that down the road. And again, I'll be saying it then too. This is all my opinion. If you are a massive Stephen King fan and he has made you wet your pants and wet your bed so many times, fucking A, great. But he does nothing for me. If you do have a complaint or a discussion or an argument, comments below. I respond occasionally to things that I think need immediate response or could benefit from it, and other ones I either respond to in a video or get around to you when I get around to you. Also, fair warning, 4 minutes in, you should probably fucking notice by now, I swear a little bit, sometimes a lot, depending on how much I'm frustrated or irritated. These won't be a very irritated, frustrated things, so for the most part, they won't be too fucking spattered with swears, but they will be a little bit, because I use them like I use exclamation points and periods. And ums. You're going to get a lot of those. If those irritate you, I'm really sorry. You should probably go away now and never look at my channel again. But anyway, terrible segue. Now that we've talked about what is horror and what's a thriller, well, at least what is horror for me, for my definitions, let's talk about something else. Let's talk about types of horror and what they mean. Because again, we're going to be going into that. The difference between a personal horror and cosmic horror. Well, let's talk about those definitions. A personal horror is that the character in the story is the one who's confronting the supernatural in themselves. The story is about their experience. Vampire the Masquerade and the early White Wolf books tried to capture the idea that the horror of the game was you were turning into a supernatural being. You were losing your humanity. You were losing your connection with the world. Now, it was never ever played that way. I'm a pen and paper role player for, in June, 28 years. So, nerd. I know. Fuck off. So, that's what they were trying to capture. The Shadow over Innsmouth by H.P. Lovecraft is another example of personal horror. Spoiler alert for an 80-year-old story, but the character is turning into one of the hybrids that he sees around town. This is his lineage. He's been called back to Innsmouth because these are his people, and he is one of them, and he's coming to terms with it as he sees them throughout the story. That's personal horror. It's not generally done, and when it is done, it's not generally done very effectively, because it's hard to get the reader into the shoes of the character while the character's also having to go through something where they're becoming less human. There's supernatural horror. Supernatural horror ramps up that supernatural aspect where you're dealing with something clearly supernatural, such as a ghost, a monster, a demon, things like that. Not like a ghost story, but more like Poltergeist. That's a supernatural horror, where the monster's not in them, but it's clearly a thing that's happening. It doesn't have to be magic or spiritual in nature. A horrifying alien abduction or encountering a race of horrible aliens is also supernatural because it goes beyond and outside the natural boundaries of what we consider to be reality. And at the other end of the spectrum from personal is cosmic horror. And cosmic horror is what Lovecraft largely excelled at. And cosmic horror is... the horror is immense. It goes way beyond what we can comprehend. It goes way beyond our understanding. It's something not a lot of authors have really been able to do to a point that is affecting to the audience. It's why Lovecraft stands out. But it's this idea that the universe itself ultimately is the horror. And the realization of your place in it is the actual horrifying element. It's the reversal of the personal horror. Personal horror is, I've become something different from the world. I've become something different from the universe. I am strange, and I am alone. Cosmic horror is, the universe is the strange one, and I am alone against it. It doesn't matter how many friends I have, how many soldiers I have, the universe itself, or some creature of absolute power, doesn't care. It's not that it's not that it's out to get you, and that's the thing with cosmic horror. Supernatural horror, it's out to get you. Cosmic horror, ultimately the revelation is you were so small and insignificant that it doesn't care if it gets you in the process of doing whatever the fuck it does naturally. And that's really the three tiers as I see it of horror. There's, personal cosmic, where you're turning into something fucking outlandish. There's personal supernatural, where you're turning into a ghost, or you've been possessed by a demon. There's striations of each, and I'm not going to try to dwell on them too much. Mostly you'll be dwelling on the difference between thriller and horror, and what is horror and what isn't horror. And to that extent, let's talk about monsters. Is having a monster in your story make it a horror story? No. That would mean every fantasy story with a dragon is also a horror story. It has to do what you do with the story, with the monster. Zombies, for instance. They're a classic horror trope in the last 50 years. I still think the best zombie movie is Night of the Living Dead, but Bone Shaker by Sherry Priest does a really good job of doing a steampunk adventure zombie story that's got a bit of horrible elements in it. It's got a couple points where you're scared for the character, but it's not really a horror story because that's not the thrust of the story. The thrust of the story is the character trying to save her son. She's not worried as much about the zombies as she is about his safety. She's not worried as much about the horrors that are out there as she is about his safety. And so the story doesn't focus on the horror. And the focus of the story is the genre. A zombie story where the main characters drive around in a truck and chuck out grenades into hordes and are never in any danger isn't a horror story. It's an action movie with zombies. So vampires, werewolves, of course, they've been sexualized and neutered in the last 20 years. So, of course, they're not horror. Ghosts aren't always horror. There is nothing that is inherently a horror story when a monster appears. So the use of the monster, what the purpose of the monster is and what it represents, is the horror. And so we'll be talking about that a bit, how they use them, how zombies are used to affect, how vampires can be used to affect, how werewolves can be used to affect. I'll be trying to use examples if I can. And that's going to be largely the majority of what I'll be doing. This isn't going to be an exciting adventure down the roller coaster of horror. It's going to be an attempt at a relatively in-depth discussion of what has worked and hasn't worked and what does work or could work in horror, and how you can frame a horror story at its basic as well as ignore me and do something better. If you think I'm wrong, again, either comment below or write something up, post it online. And that's the thing we need. This is a generation that could create a new Lovecraft circle. If you, I kind of just want to go do a video on the Lovecraft circle, but I don't know how much time I have on this video before my memory runs out. So I'm just going to say, basically, if you don't know what Lovecraft circle is, the Cthulhu mythos as it exists, if you know what that is H.P. Lovecraft created a basic mythology, just the bare bones, and other authors that he was writing letters to, and they were trading correspondences because they were all writing for the same magazines and the same publications. They all wrote stories in this mythology. They all used each other's monsters. They all used each other's gods. They all used each other's books. They used each other's characters as reference points. They used each other as characters if you actually have read a couple of Lovecraft and Robert Bloch stories. And if you don't know who Robert Bloch is, he's the guy who wrote the original version of Psycho. He was part of the Lovecraft circle. And that circle never really ended. It just stopped being letters. Barker, King, most of the modern horror writers have written at least one Lovecraft thing, at least as an homage to the person they read as a kid. We could do that again in this day and age. But we got to get more people interested in doing horror. We got to get more people interested in writing about something that is visceral and hard and occasionally mean and not afraid to offend. And that's what we got to do. If you're interested in horror, if you're interested in a cohesive universe, follow me on Twitter. Follow other authors on Twitter. Follow other people in horror on Twitter. I don't know if we should do a hashtag or not because I don't fucking care about hashtags, generally speaking. Other videos notwithstanding. I'm not big on social media. You may find me on social media. It's likely I never check it. I only check Twitter 2-3 times a day. That sounds like a lot for me, but I haven't checked Facebook in 6 months, so don't bother looking for me there. I haven't checked anywhere else ever. But add me here. We'll subscribe or follow me, or talk to me, or put a comment down letting me know an email address, and we will. Or that would actually be a terrible idea. Don't put any contact information in the comments. It's the fucking internet. But let's get a new Lovecraft circle going. Let's get a new circle of horror writers who are willing to share ideas and share concepts and create something big again. Not Cthulhu and Nyarlathotep and Azathoth. And yes, I've read most of his works, so I could probably name most of the gods, although you could consider me pronouncing it wrong. I'm rambling at this point, so I'm going to close it up in just a moment and just say, look, like I said, I'm going to try to put out a video a week. My wife has suggested I set up a Patreon. I still feel a little skeevy about that, so if you really think you'd support a fucking dude in a hat talking about horror tropes and horror ideas every week, by all means, listen to the comments below. If I get enough people interested, I'll fucking set one up. But as it is, I don't give a shit. It would just incentivize it. That's really all. Other than that, I'm going to try to put out one video a week. I will not be setting a day until I have a schedule in mind. But might do 2 a week, might do 3 a week for a couple weeks. And let's talk horror. Let's figure out horror. Let's create something new and terrifying that our grandchildren will be reading authors who are trying to write stuff to remember us. And how we do it is we create a world together. All of us, horror fans. Even if you don't want to write the story, let's start a circle. Let's share ideas. Let's do something horrible.